Hi, everyone. Thank you for bearing with me for a moment. Just wanted to get a little bit of quiet here before we start. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today in the second of our International Women's Day speaker series. And it's very exciting because we're not just talking about one of my favorite topics, which is gender equality, and another one of my favorite topics, which is impact investing. We're looking at some very dynamic market-changing innovations in this space. Yesterday, we looked at the Women's Livelihood Bond pioneered by the Impact Investing Exchange. And today, I'm delighted to have with me Jeanette Gurung, who is pioneering one of the most exciting products I've come across in the gender lens investment space. Jeanette has been an innovator at the nexus of gender equality and climate-related sectors for 3 decades. She's worked with public and private organizations. She's the founder and executive director of WOCAN, which is a global network across 114 countries, which focuses on capacity building for women's leadership and empowerment and gender integration. She created the W+ standard to measure, quantify, and monetize impacts of projects and supply chains on women's empowerment through the use of results-based financing. Very interesting. She's co-founded the Women and Climate Impact Fund to mobilize blended finance into climate mitigation and adaptation projects that incorporate high levels of gender equality and women's empowerment using the W+ standard. So Jeanette, this is a product unlike anything I've seen, and we're going to definitely dedicate a lot of time today to talking about the W+ standard. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, which I think is something that the students are going to find very illuminating and hopefully can relate to later technical work, I wanted to start off just high level. And high level, I wanted to understand for you, why is gender equality so important to global economic growth and recovery?
Thank you very much, Tara, and it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to all of you today and share ideas about this. Tara and I have been sharing ideas around the W+ and various types of impact financing for some time. So there's a lot to talk about, and I have a tendency to get too excited and talk too much, so I'll just jump right in. So I'm going to speak specifically to why gender equality is so critical to the sectors that I'm most familiar with, which are sustainable agriculture and climate change, mitigation and adaptation resilience. So, you know, this is nothing new, but I think still needs to be said that women provide the lion's share of the labor for farming, for healthcare, for caregivers, and so many other aspects of our life. And it's women's economic power that drives economic growth. However, women are not able to enact their agency fully by not and don't receive equal access to technology, to financial resources, to training, etc., to enable the growth. And again, this is not new. WOCAN is 18 years old. I'm a forester by training. I've been involved in this work in international development. Have lived most of my life in South and Southeast Asia. We have 3 decades of knowledge about this. I think that the COVID crisis really brought into focus how unequal our societies are. It definitely exacerbated inequality. But it also brought our attention, I think, to the value of women's unpaid care inputs. And I'll say that as a speaker now situated in the US, where I have to say, I'm now in a part of the world where gender inequality is not as much, I think, considered as it is in much of the global South. And there tends to be this thinking here that these are not problems that are so critical to us in developed economies. I think COVID crisis sort of showed us a different reality as people left their workplaces, returned to their homes, and guess what? They were suddenly confronted with who takes care of the kids when we don't have schools open, et cetera. Who's managing the care giving for COVID patients, et cetera. And I think that this is, many of the businesses, for example, I would say in the developed economies are thinking about gender diversity and gender gender diversity, and usually thinking of it within terms of their HR policies inside their companies. And that's not what WOCON thinks about or is concerned about. We're much more concerned about, we could say, women at the grassroots, the inequality that exists within agriculture organizations, forestry organizations, etc. And yes, there is a link between what goes on inside a company or an organization and what goes on in terms of the beneficiaries or the customers or whatever you want to call it at the grassroots level. But we find not enough attention is given at that lower level, bottom of the pyramid kind of thing. So I think there is this new appreciation of workers and women in the supply chains, women holding together their families. Look at Ukraine. I mean, yesterday we were looking at what women there are doing amazing things just to hold it together mentally, as well as physically holding their families together. But there's also this awareness of the inequality of household tasks within all households across the world, I would say. But all of this is not enough. We need to be able to value women's work, and we need to be able to compensate women for the contributions that we have learned we cannot do without. We've seen it in times of crises, but we know that they exist in everyday work. And I want to talk in particular here about something you don't hear much about, which is the women's unpaid care labor in relation to the environment. So there's a lot of discussion of women's unpaid care in the home, in the household, in the community, in the society. But I want to link this to what women do in relation to taking care of the environment. And I will even say that it's and we'll talk more about carbon and carbon emissions and all, but I will even say here that it is women's unrecognized, uncompensated inputs of labor and knowledge that in fact are allowing many of the kind of climate projects to produce the kind of emissions reductions on the back of women, unrecognized as usual, that various entities, governments, project developers, companies are engaged in a whole business around trading of emissions credits, which I'll talk much more about, that there is this invisible aspect of women in relation to that. So that's all I'll say on that point, Tara.
I think you gave a little taster and left, everyone's mouth watering, wondering, what does she mean? What are these invisible threads that she's referring to? So with that, I'll quickly get into my next question, which has two parts. The first is, what are you and your organization doing to further gender equality? And the second is, what is the business case or commercial angle that complements this gender impact? And you started to allude to that or foreshadow it. So I open the floor for you to break that down for us now.
Okay. So because our focus at WOCON, and I should say that WOCON stands for Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture and Natural Resource Management. And we are a not-for-profit, we're a membership of basically women and men who are professionals and have expertise in those sectors across the world. So all of them have an interest in gender or gender expertise, but we're not just gender people. We are primarily people who are grounded in these sectors. And I think these are, the reason I formed WOCON 18 years ago was that these are sectors very much dominated by men. And I don't want to say men physically, but by a male understanding of the world and imbued with male bias. I could tell you, I did my own PhD on how organizations are gendered. That's a whole nother discussion, but I think in fact, organizations themselves are gendered and so reinforce these various biases. And this is what goes on in agriculture, forestry, water management, and these kind of sectors that are now very much aligned to climate change actions. And at times, these types of organizations are even toxic to the women who are working inside of them. In fact, that is why we created WOCON as a separate organization to have our own space. But an example of this I want to say is this bias is think about what comes to your mind when you think about a farmer I think throughout the world, the notion of farming is pretty much identified with the man as something that men do, even though the numbers bear out the reality that it really is women who are the majority of agriculture workers and farmers across the world. So that kind of thinking and bias creeps up throughout the organization and has an impact on everything that's done. So part of what Wokan is doing is just to surface this reality, and always have to do this. It's to bring in, and so women have again been this kind of invisible force behind the production of food, for example, or the caring for the environment, or all those other things. This in the climate change world, what this has meant is this association of women with vulnerability and victimhood, the two V's as I call it. Yes, women are at the front lines and also in positions of vulnerability, but the narrative that frames women with victimhood and vulnerability means that you can just keep them on the sideline and think of them as victims and therefore in need of charitable responses, rather than understanding women as primary agents of change and therefore people that must be included in your interventions, in your investments. So one area we are, and we've made really great strides at bringing this nexus of gender and climate to the forefront. And I will say that the last COP, the climate change meeting in Glasgow, was a sea change for those of us who've been promoting gender within the climate community and climate within the gender investing community. The two have finally started to come together and talk about this, but still the narrative is focused on women's role in adaptation and resilience, which is one side of the climate discussions, and the other one, where all the money is, I will add, is in the mitigation sections. And this is because there is a market, and I'll talk more about that, but there is a market that will reward those actors that are engaging in the reduction of carbon emissions are financially rewarded for that. So it's a space for investors and markets. The adaptation side is still seen as grant funding, charitable contribution to these poor victims, right? So you can see where women sit in this, and that sort of, I think, starts to frame some of the challenges we have. But so here I make the argument that it's women's labor and knowledge that's critical to managing water supplies, managing forest resources, sources of cooking energy, etc. These are all primarily women's activities at a grassroots level. And they rely on women who are, again, these kind of invisible workforce behind everything. This is unpaid, absolutely, not recognized, not compensated. And so I can tell you that this, for me, is a public good that women are providing, that for a service that benefits the entire planet. What women do to reduce carbon emissions, for example, first, let's say maintaining nurseries, planting trees. Not only planting trees, you got to nurture them or they die. Who does that? In many places, it's women. So I can say that they are delivering this service that has a public good and needs to be financed, and they need to be compensated in a way for the provision of that public good that we all benefit from and the planet benefits from. So in order to get to that point, you need to put an economic value on them and their work, and we need to provide them with financial resources to do more of what they're already doing and to do it better and to scale that up. So all of this is based on understanding of women as the key stakeholders. And also from a business perspective and an investment perspective, we don't think enough about risk and how the exclusion of women is a risk to whatever project or investment that you're engaged in. You can imagine, if you understand that they are primary agents of change and primary stakeholders, you need to make sure that they are in fact engaged in whatever you're doing and benefiting from. And if you don't, you run a risk that, I always say this, and maybe I shouldn't, but what if women started to get really angry about the fact that they're ignored from all of this and decide to no longer take care of that forest, but in fact set fire to it? Then all of your investments related to that commodity of forest are gone, simply because you didn't do a process that brought benefits to those that are most engaged in it. So I think this is not largely understood by investors. I know if we speak the language of risk, we can probably attract their attention. I think we in the gender community have not done a sufficient job at talking about the risks of exclusion. And also in the investment world, there's also biases that will not see women in this role. So how do we surface this role of women, and how do we value it? And we created this W+ standard, which I'll tell you more about. But basically, we thought we need to find a way to see women's contribution, and put a value on those contributions using a market-based approach. This was inspired by our understanding of carbon and carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, that we created actually, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, that showed how putting a financial value on a measurable environmental impact can generate tradable assets, which we all know as carbon offsets or carbon credits, and that this can lead to increased investments, and it can also affect the design of climate-related projects across a wide spectrum. There's standards that were created that allow a standardized way of reporting on the progress. So it's the carbon markets that enable buyers to purchase those carbon credits that support carbon emission reducing projects, such as those that provide clean energy solutions or protect forest, or there's so many other ways to do this that can absorb or avoid the carbon emissions. This is seen as the way to contribute to reducing global emissions footprints across the world, and you probably know a lot about this. The notion behind this is that the market is going to reward those behaviors that have changed to produce this result. So in other words, whose behaviors has changed? Well, the project owners, the project developers, whether these be NGOs, projects, or companies, who's doing things differently now. So they are to be rewarded. But also the idea here was to reward the person who stopped cutting trees, for example, or who switched to a clean cook stove from a wood burning stove, for example. They are to be rewarded as well. And that is, again, down at the community level, the household level. So this is about 2011, when we were really learning about this carbon market, voluntary carbon market. And we had this crazy idea that could we use the same concept for the purpose of scaling up women's empowerment activities. The same idea of measuring something through a standardized process and then giving it a monetary value, which again is going to translate to that monetary value to women's unpaid work and contributions to climate actions. And I would just say that the difference here is that we decided the W+ standard should also require a benefit sharing mechanism to the women of the community, but I will talk more about that. So as Tara said, I'm kind of teasing you. Tara, do you want me to keep going? There's a lot to say on this.
Yes, I mean, I think you started off by showing the parallels, but you can get into how the W+ standard works, and give an example of a project.
Okay, perfect. And if you see questions coming up in the chat, which I don't see, just bring them to my attention. So the idea of the W+ standard was to create also what we call a triple win. Was one for those companies, projects that are using this standard as a mechanism to measure women's empowerment impact, and to then be certified for that. They can brag about that to their consumers or whoever's supporting them, and they are going to also receive new revenues from the sale of the credits. It's also for women at the bottom that are going to get additional benefits, but also be receiving revenues that are part of the benefit sharing from the sale of these W+ credits. And for investors, it gives them a way to report on impact in a rigorous way. It's a proof that women are reached, and a measurement. I'll talk more about the way we can measure gender outcomes. So, okay, I had this lined up to talk about SDGs, but so we created this in 2014, motivated by three things. First, a sense of frustration. I think frustration is the mother of all innovation, and I'm very frustrated and have been at many points in my life. So it forces me to think about how do we do things differently. So WOCAN has been doing gender mainstreaming capacity building for decades. That means we know how to advise and train staff of a company or organization how they integrate gender into everything they do. But we realized that it was not producing the hoped for results. And we organizations continue and companies continue to measure project outputs instead of outcomes. And companies do this all the time. I was listening to a report about the SDGs and how we're doing on SDG 5, and they said, we're not doing well. Companies are not doing well. Companies are still reporting on how many women, numbers of women who were serviced, or how many women were included. But we would say that doesn't mean anything. Let's get to the so what. Okay, you trained 100 women, so what was the result? So, but that's not happening. So that was one frustration. And it was this kind of box checking for gender, even for donor agencies that claim to support grants only for organizations that are addressing gender. Quite frankly, they're made happy by one sentence that said, we are addressing gender. Box check, good enough, right? That cannot be good enough. Second, we wanted to address this bias within particularly environmental organizations that I mentioned. So what we assess is those organizations were not doing much. It wasn't a question of not having capacity. It was a question of incentivizing. There was neither a big enough stick nor a big enough carrot to get them to change their behaviors. So they did not perceive risk from not doing and paying attention to gender. Why should they bother? It's a lot of extra work. So we said, could we develop an incentive system that was going to bring profits for this changed behavior that's going to now support activities that benefit women and gender equality? And thirdly, for WOCAN, and this is the most important thing for us as a women-led NGO, was the need to bring new funding to women's groups and others working on women's empowerment, gender equality that are not recognized nor funded. It's pathetic. It's the numbers are, less than 1% of all funding, grant funding for public funding goes to supporting women-led organizations, even at the international level, much less the grassroots level. So we are convinced that that is the great untapped potential to address climate and food insecurity around the world, are these women's collectives. They're not always business organizations, but they're women working together on these kind of projects. So we really wanted to find a way to generate funds for those groups without relying on the meager donor funding that was available. So we developed W+ standard. Again, as you understand, we were inspired by the understanding of how you measure carbon, bringing it to an understanding of this, how we're going to measure women's empowerment. And we did it for 4 reasons. We wanted to increase the rigor and accountability of those project level gender initiatives, not women inside the companies and the management and the boards. We wanted to do that to make women's work visible and valued. 2, we wanted to incentivize new investments in women's empowerment. 3, we wanted to create a market-oriented, results-based financing mechanism using a recognizable tool for businesses and organizations. I say this particularly for businesses who are, because they're all purchasing carbon offsets, that understanding of paying for an outcome-based result, an outcome, is not that foreign anymore because the carbon market system kind of open that door. And then lastly, to create this new revenue for women's groups as a way to compensate them for their knowledge and labor. So what this is once a project decides to use the W plus standard, we have 6 domains that the standard can apply to: time saving, income, changes in time saving, changes in income and asset, changes in knowledge and education, health, food security, and leadership. So at any initiative that's undertaken with women within a community that brings about at least a change in one of those 6 areas, we can use the W plus standard for. Each of those 6 areas has a methodology that's combining qualitative and quantitative methodologies that come up with a formula which is needed to come up with a number. Remember, we're quantifying that change. So we are measuring change as a percent of change. We're measuring a percent of change from a baseline study to the results, to a monitoring results that's done at whatever time that company decides they've generated results, which we're measuring the change, reporting it in a change of impact. And then we translate that percent of impact into a W plus unit. One W plus unit equals a 10% change for one woman over this period of time of the measurement. So then so now these units, you want to break in, Tara?
No, I just think it's, I mean, yeah, you're getting into nuts and bolts. This is exactly what I wanted to understand, and I think the students can understand as well.
Okay, so once those units are generated, they are tradable assets, they're tradable credits, and they are owned by whoever developed that project. In other words, whoever was paying for and implementing activities that resulted in women's empowerment, whether it's an NGO, a company, investor, whatever, they are the owner of those units. Now, what are they going to do with those? They're going to try to sell them. Where are they going to sell them to? Well, that market is still developing. I'd love to tell you it's already well developed. We are very much in process of developing a stronger market around this. But right now, I think we are poised at the start of a very large interest in that kind of market. And the idea is that these W plus units can be purchased by individuals, by companies, by governments, by investors, very similar to the way that carbon credits are also purchased.
Exactly.
So that for those of you who don't know about carbon, there's a very vibrant carbon market, voluntary carbon market that is growing by leaps and bounds. Right now, it's particularly active, and everyone I know in the carbon markets is very, very busy and has sold out their units for going forward for the next few years. I think it's currently an $800 million market with a high growth happening right as we speak. So those offsets, you might call them, or credits, are being purchased by companies, for example, who also want to show their contributions to net zero emissions reduction. But it's also seen as a way just to make contributions to these kind of climate projects. Now, what's interesting is that the W plus standard is a standalone standard. It can be used to measure women's empowerment under any kind of project. There's nothing to do with carbon or environment necessarily. For example, one application was used by a bank in Vietnam that was doing financial literacy education for marginalized women in remote areas of Vietnam. We measured their changes in knowledge for that and generated the units. But in the climate world, what's extremely interesting is that we can generate what's called W plus labeled carbon credits. So in other words, for any project that's already measuring its carbon emission reductions and simultaneously doing things that are benefiting women, they can measure with both standards at the same time. And so it's a label on top of a carbon credit that indicates to the buyer that this has got this social benefit that also addresses SDG 5. And so the idea is that these sell at a premium price. So the project developer who's doing this is getting a higher price. They're also having a kind of a distinction that their carbon is a different kind of carbon. You could, in some places, called charismatic carbon. Isn't that an interesting way to describe a carbon credit? It comes from a charismatic project. It's a funny, I know I wouldn't have used that word, but in other words, there's always a good story around that carbon, where this is not just some cheap carbon. This is helping women, and here's how women are engaged. I'll tell you, I've been hearing some fascinating projects that are planning to do this. A group of Aboriginal women in Australia who are doing fire management and fire prevention for forest, right? That one is particularly charismatic because it's got women doing this, very technical work of fire control and fire management in an area that's, again, very male dominated. And they're also measuring their carbon emissions. So super cool, but I got a lot of other projects like that. So the world has kind of gotten interested in this all of a sudden. We've been pushing this boulder up the mountain for the last 6 years with not a lot of interest, but not a lot of action. So now in the voluntary carbon world, there are moves by serious financial institutional players. Mark Carney, for example, is leading one that is focusing on a different kind of carbon offset that has high quality carbon offsets. What does that mean? Amazing to me. And even at the COP, for the first time, I'm starting to hear carbon markets people talk about SDGs. So the idea that you can link a carbon credit to an SDG goal is particularly fascinating. And I will argue that the system is already in place for that. I mean, when the carbon markets, that is very well established business, starts to get interested in those kind of social benefits, we've got real chance to scale this up. So, the price of the unit or the price of the premium for W plus on top of a carbon credit, it's not a fixed thing. The platforms that are selling this are not going to go low. This is not the case where, like carbon, it went down to 5 cents a ton. That cannot happen. These are people and not carbon credits, right? So the early units were sold for $2.40 per unit. Some of the units were sold for €5. The discussions that are in place now are for prices that are 2, 3, 4 times that, as high as that. So in other words, if this market demand starts to become significant, this indeed is the force that will drive the incentive for more and more of these to happen. Shall I take a break? Other questions that I should? Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because within the MBA, I definitely remember covering social impact bonds, and we looked at the mechanics for a social impact bond. We didn't actually delve into carbon credits at the time. I don't know if the current MBA students are looking into carbon credits, but within a social impact bond, you're starting to think about results-based financing. So exactly. To bring them together in this way, when carbon credits have had so much uptake and they continue to grow and grow, and they're established, institutionalized in the market, although you have SDG bonds, I haven't seen any other monetization of other SDGs. And it's also interesting because climate and gender, I believe, are 2 of the SDGs that are the most synergistic with other SDGs, which then relates to my other question, which is, how does this link to achieving other SDGs?
So, I mean, this is exactly it. And I'm going to stick to climate, Tara, just because that's our thing. So, as I said, at WOCON, we've had 1 foot in the gender lens investing community and 1 foot in the environment and also to some degree the carbon markets communities. And so we've been trying to, teach each community about the other. Until recently, with not too much success. And I have to say that it's really been more of a challenge to get climate into gender than it has been to get gender into climate. Again, I think there's always biases. this is where I met you in the gender lens community, but I think why isn't that group thinking about carbon markets? If carbon markets are such a interesting area of work, and if there's so many revenues and profits to be gained, why don't we have women-led SMEs and enterprises who are what we can now call women climate entrepreneurs? If we've been doing some research to understand where are women in the whole carbon market ecosystem, and it's not surprising, but it's disappointing that although there are women-led climate projects and women are engaging in these activities, they aren't seeing the carbon markets as anything to be understood or taken seriously. Why is that? Is it considered, carbon markets are considered too technical, too geeky, too risky? It's expensive to measure carbon, no question about it. It's not that expensive to measure with women's empowerment, I have to say, but for carbon can be expensive. Fantastic opportunity for investors who could then come in and say, right, we can pre-finance, or we can even now there's opportunities to pre-purchase those kind of carbon emissions, and therefore, provide, that would be game-changing to get women engaged in this. But I mean, there's many SDGs that are also related to water, to food security. We can use a climate lens. We can use climate markets, I think, in part to also support women's stronger engagement in those other SDGs that are in fact related to landscape and water and climate related solutions. It's not happening right now. It's, again, I think this report, I was just on a webinar, UN Women just sent out a report on where we are with SDG goals being addressed. It's not good for SDG 5 in particular we're talking about. It's in part because the reporting is not there. It's, and it's interesting, we hear about compliance markets, for example, with carbon emissions. I mean, particularly in Europe, where companies are forced to talk about what their carbon emissions are. And I've been asked this question, would we ever see there would be a compliance market for gender equality? Not in my lifetime, probably. I can't imagine it, right? So we have to use these kind of voluntary mechanisms. But these crossover opportunities, and again, even within, again, the carbon markets is also very male-dominated kind of thinking around what goes on around that. We, even with these new initiatives to build a higher level of integrity and quality of the carbon emissions, we stepped in and we wrote a white paper on how measuring women's empowerment and gender outcomes could, in fact, within the carbon market systems, could upscale the climate as well as the women's empowerment outcomes. Crickets, heard nothing back from them. We pushed and we said, we can provide you with gender experts on your committees. No interest until a couple months ago. And then suddenly they've now appointed one of my colleagues with a paid position as a gender expert inside these initiatives to scale up carbon markets. So, wow. I see this as a big milestone and a big crack in this area that is so far not thinking about how they could, get this co-benefit for women's empowerment. And I think it's because there's a tool that exists. I think, so often we hear from companies and others is, oh, we can't measure women's empowerment. Forget about putting a value on it, financial value. People think that's impossible. So it's only impossible until you do it. And then it's not, right? And so I think the fact that we created this standard back in 2014, and it's been used, it's been awarded, it's received awards from UNFCCC, et cetera, means that it's just that not that many people may be aware of the existence of it, but it's out there, it's already working, it's already producing results. And I think where we're going is we now have a new collaboration that's going to be piloting the W+ standard inside outcome-linked funds. I think this is going to get to your point. And in particular, one that's a gender outcome-based fund that is very, it's wonderful for when we discover each other because we speak the same language. And their frustration has also been that funds who claim to be measuring outcomes don't know how to do it. and don't understand that you could tie a payment, an outcome-based payment to your fund. And so that would enable two things for an outcome-based fund could do with that is either they could use the W plus credits and the market opportunities to drive revenue that could be coming back into the fund, and they could require that all the companies that they will invest in will achieve a W plus certification. And by doing so, that what they're talking about is then producing favorable terms of credit to those companies that can achieve this kind of outcome. And therefore, the other way to think about it that we're probably not there yet is that once you have a credit, a social credit like a W plus credit, you could be talking to your investors about accepting a credit in lieu of a financial return on your investment, or in addition to, for example. So, the world is full of people who call themselves impact investors. A lot of us are skeptical about how serious they are about impact first that they like to talk about. If you're really impact first, would you be willing to take some of your payment back in the form of a credit that shows a social impact?
That's interesting. In this era where I believe they're saying up to 70% of institutional AUM in the next few years is supposed to be within ESG, and this massive rise of the ESG funds over the past 2 years, both public and private markets, and concurrently with the rise of greenwashing and impact washing to the point where MSCI stripped 1,200 financial institutions and companies of their ESG labels just last week. In this era, the validation of outcomes is particularly needed and compelling. That said, it'd be great if you could walk us through high level how you would validate a particular gender outcome, just to make it really clear for students who are thinking about paths in this space.
Okay, so and I realize this time is flying. We want to have some time for questions. So I would say that everybody should go to the website, because that I should put it in there, or maybe you can, WPLUS.org. So there's a lot more information there about the steps. But basically we start with the consultation with women of the community to understand. So as I said, there are these 6 domains you have to choose from. Which one is most relevant to the context that you're dealing with? And that's the flexibility of the W plus. So it's standardized, but we allow context specific things to occur. So you may say, we've supported cook stoves and they've saved women time. Okay, we're just going to use time domain. In that case, then we will provide you with the method documents that will give you the indicators for what we're looking for, evidence-based indicators of what we're looking for. And then you develop, there's something called the design document that's developed that talks about those indicators. And then there's a set of questionnaires that are very specific to that particular project. Those questionnaires are then, we have an app, they're uploaded into an app. And then we hire, I say we, but whoever's doing the measurement, what we've been doing when WOCON is asked to help with the measurement is we hire local women as the enumerators. We train them. That's been a fantastic experience. They all have smartphones. They can use their app. They get to ask the questions of the other women in their communities of this, right? And that forms the baseline. Then the activities are undertaken. There's more, whatever, cook stoves delivered or whatever. And then the project may say, okay, in six months or in 1 year's time, we want to come back and measure what's the impact. We send those same women enumerators out with the same questionnaires, and they can determine. And then we analyze the change between baseline and results. And then we write a report. And then there's an independent third party verification done. That it's not in-depth social impact assessment. That's not what it is. It's checking to make sure that the process has been followed and that the results are validated. And at that point, then WOCON gets the report and then issues the units, which are then up in a registry, and that's where they're maintained to assure transparency. So we use Market, which is a big company in New York City, manages many registries. So units are held there until they're sold. Once they're sold, they are retired and moved off of the registry. So anytime it's possible to know who is owning how many W plus credits, and how many are left on the market for others to purchase. The 20% that's required as the revenue sharing must be shared with women groups in that community of the project, right? And so the mechanisms for how that money gets to the women are designated at the time of this project design document. After the units are sold, that 20% needs to move to women of the community. Women that decide themselves what to do with that money. If they want to buy more cook stoves, fine. In many cases, they don't, and they will use it for what they know is best, suits the needs of their communities. And then how they use the money and the fact they get the money is also verified in the next cycle of measurement.
Is any of this tech enabled, just out of curiosity? Like, is it on the blockchain or anything like that?
There's a lot of people interested to put it on the blockchain. We're a little bit, seeing how that goes. I mean, we all know about blockchains, and my problem with blockchains is that they're so themselves generating so many carbon emissions. I'm not sure. That's the part of it I'm not happy with. But it is exactly perfect for a blockchain application because it has that transparency and allows you to monitor. Yeah.
We're at about 10 minutes, and so I wanted to open up and see if any of the students or other audience members had questions. Otherwise, I do have some follow-up ones myself. I see that there was a question from Jessica, which we missed while we're waiting to see if anyone else has questions, which is, you mentioned the invisible work of women doing environmental work. Can you tell us about this more with an intersectional lens? She's referencing the research of Black American women's unpaid labor and community organizing, for example. Is it all women, and within women, who is bearing the burden of this work?
I mean, I can't speak specifically to that. She does use the word intersectional lens, and I would like to say that's enough. We're a bunch of geeky gender experts here, and for us, intersectionality is also really critical. So we don't see women as a unified category, right? So that happens where within the standard, we require at the point of the consultation with local women, that also requires a gender analysis be done at that level. And that's when, so whether I had this question just yesterday on a thing I do with the World Bank and asking, what about Indigenous people, Indigenous women? I said, yeah, absolutely. That all gets documented and understood right from the beginning. We make sure that all those various types of women have a voice in understanding this, and that also have to be receiving benefits proportionally.
Oh, wow, that's really good. That's powerful. So that means each time you do it in a country, it's calibrated to the country to be representative of the unique realities of women across race and class.
To the project, right? We're not working usually at a country level, although we could, but it's what's specific to that particular project area and the communities that live there.
Thus far, has it mostly been focused on projects or focused on companies?
Good question. Very good question. It's mostly been on projects. That's kind of a natural thing for WOCON, but also fitting in with a carbon perspective. But recently we did apply it for 2 companies in Kenya. That's interesting for us to see how companies, does it incentivize a company to do more for women's empowerment? I think we still have to see how that goes, but in one case it was an agribusiness company, another case it was a transport company. These revenues that'll come in from the sale of the credits are going to be, just windfalls for them. It's interesting for us to also think about intentionality. Ideally, we're applying the W plus to a company or a project that has an intention to do more for women's empowerment. Or if they don't, we're trying to show them that there are financial incentive reasons that you should do more. Our hope is that they're going to do multiple years of W plus standard. I mean, you can keep doing this, right? You can measure validate, sell units, do it again, do it again, do it again. And this is the intention here, is to provide sustainable revenue to support these kind of projects going on for years. So yeah, it's a good question, Tara.
Yeah, of course. It's when it comes to building a market, it's about creating a network effect where it gets big enough that there's its own momentum because you know that you can sell it. We ironically covered that in the MBA, our first semester, the network effect. And so I guess it is that process of building the market that'll generate a strong enough network effect. And then it's probably going to unlock a massive wave. Any advice that you would like to share from your journey? And this is on two levels, interestingly. First, where to begin, what to prioritize for other emerging leaders who care about these issues. And could be gender, this could be outcome-based financing, this could be the convergence of gender and the environment, all of which speak to your journey. So any learnings from your journey that if you could look back,
I think it's a great time to be involved in at the nexus of all of these things, because there's just these fantastic the world has changed. And look what happened in Ukraine. They're talking about companies pulling out of Russia, making sacrifices for the human. I mean, when does that happen in a company? You've never seen that before, right? So I think it's such a fascinating time. But I think advice I'd say is think about standards and certification systems, because that gets us out of the greenwashing, pink washing, impact washing. We've got to move in that direction. Think about measuring outcomes and how you can monetize these. We're convinced there are markets for that, whether it's in the carbon market, whether it's the impact finance market. And the other thing, I think what I learned, would I do things differently? I don't know. I learned for the first time about the disadvantage of being a first mover, right? I didn't know what that meant. I mean, we created the standard out there when nobody else was thinking about things like this. And it's taken years to just hang in there and kind of wait for the world to catch up with us and see that maybe we're onto something. So yeah, that's what everybody's super excited. I've been talking to hundreds and hundreds of people over the years about W+, and never have I found anybody who's not excited by it. But how to get that to translate into uptake and action has been very difficult. And I've learned that nobody wants to go first. I really thought, stupidly, that people wanted to be out there and to be leaders and to get the public recognition for that. And I've learned that is not the truth. They want to be second. They want somebody else to take the risk. So if any of you out there can be risk takers, I'd say go for it. I think the world is ready for risk takers. There's just a huge appetite, especially after COVID. It just upended things. People want to do things to change their life. They're more interested in have quality life. And so how do we build on that and bring benefits into, to bring investments down to women's organizations at the community level that are still hugely, enormously underfunded and underattended to? Yeah, that would be my learnings on that.
And then also any advice from the entrepreneurial side of your journey. So we talked about the broader impact side, but for any of the students, Oxford has a really high rate of entrepreneurs in the MBA class consistently. Any learnings from your entrepreneurial journey, whether or not it's specific to women entrepreneurs or more broadly?
Well, I've become an entrepreneur, even though I am a not-for-profit, because the world for nonprofits is miserable. I mean, the idea that, and it's insulting, quite frankly, that you have to beg for charitable contributions. I have a PhD in gender and a master's in forestry and 50 years of experience, and I can't get a grant. I have to compete with 700 other people to get a grant. It's just ridiculous. Let's not waste our time. Let's see how social enterprises, including NGOs, can be funded in ways that, and investors don't always have to have these massive high returns. There must be ways, as I said, the W Plus can enable a way to bring a return to investor and at the same time grant funding down to women's organizations. It's one mechanism. But I want to speak, my passion right now is women climate entrepreneurs. And, like I said, all these women, I just see this tremendous space women in the entrepreneurial world who can engage in something like a carbon market and find out, and I want to demystify carbon markets for those women entrepreneurs who just find it too technical and geeky. It's not. And the returns could be fantastic. So if any of you out there have interest in kind of whether as an entrepreneurial way or supportive entrepreneurs or impact investing or whatever, I think there's so many spaces that are new and opening up because of this interest in SDGs and climate goals.
I might be circling back to you about that. It's an area where there is a lot of interest and people do need insight, like the insight that you're able to share. So be careful what you wish for.
That's it.
And thank you for taking the time out to chat with us. Thank you for today's fireside chat. I'm such a huge supporter of W+. It's so pioneering and innovative. I just thought that the students would be remiss to not learn about the way that you can bring gender, environment, impact, and accountability together in this way that is so needed in this era of greenwashing and impact washing. So I hope that they're able to learn something from your story today. And thank you once again, and happy International Women's Day and happy Women's Month.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. Thanks for the chance to speak. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.